Hi, it's Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today I'm going to be checking out one of my favorite EQs for mastering. This is a hardware EQ that I kind of learned mastering on. It is the Maselec MEA-2, and it's just been reissued in plugin form by Relab. Relab were kind enough to give me a license to this and also put me on a phone call with a man who designed this, a guy named Leif Masses, a Swedish engineer living for a long time and working in England, who's worked on major records with major artists. But even more than being a producer and engineer, Masses is really known for his Maselec gear, which became big, I'd say, starting in about the mid-1990s, and by the early 2000s was in mastering studios across the world. This particular EQ, the MEA-2, is probably one of the most heard EQs in history. For a long time, records coming out of London in particular, 80 or 90% of major label releases in England were going through this EQ at the mastering stage at some of the biggest mastering houses over there. There's a whole bunch of American and European audio engineers who absolutely love this thing, and these hardware units cost something around $8,000-ish at the time I'm recording this. So this is expensive boutique high-end hardware that's now available in plugin form. And I was super excited to try it out because the first half of my career in mastering was spent with this EQ and maybe one other in mastering studio I was working at over at Joe Lambert Mastering. Ever since I got this thing into my computer a few months ago, I've been using it on literally every mastering session I've done. And I want to give you today a sense for why you might want to check this thing out, what makes it special, what makes it unique, and why a super clean mastering grade analog EQ is relevant in the age of plugins. So let's talk about it. Now, before we get into audio examples, and we will get into audio examples, I'm actually going to record a whole separate video that gives you a look into my mastering process and how I think about EQing in mastering, focusing on the four main shapes that really any master is going to take when it comes to EQ. But before we dive into that stuff, I just want to dive into the controls here and dive into a little bit of the history of this unit. First, I'll make the case for why you wouldn't be interested in this EQ. It does seem a little crazy because the Maselec MEA-2, one of the reasons it was so celebrated by mastering engineers for the past 30 or so years is because it's so clean. It's so precise, it's so low distortion, but aren't these all things that digital plugins do really well? Why do we need a model of an analog EQ that's made to be clean and precise and low distortion and high headroom? Don't we potentially get that out of any stock digital EQ we might use? And the answer there is, I think there's still three major reasons why this kind of plugin might be interesting to you, even if you already have really clean, really flexible digital EQs. The first one here applies to almost any analog model EQ, and the second two are even more unique to this one. And the first reason I like this kind of clean, precise analog model EQ is it is a totally different EQing experience than using some of these more modern graphical digital EQs, where you see a whole frequency analyzer in front of you, and you have this endless number of frequency points you could put there on the graph. With a lot of modern digital EQs, as powerful as they are, it becomes a very eyes-first way of working, where you're looking for spots in the frequency spectrum to turn up or down, and then you're looking at the curve that you're creating, and you're getting these preconceived notions and ideas about whether or not it's the right looking curve for the sound you're trying to achieve. And when you start to use a more analog style user interface like this one, it's just so much more of an ears-first approach to listening and EQing. Rather than looking at a frequency analyzer and being biased by what it's showing you, you really have to listen to the track and figure out what, if anything, needs to change, and then go and try to make that change. You also aren't confronted with seeing the curve that you're creating visually, and this again makes you listen more. Making half dB, dB, dB and a half, 2 dB, 2.5 dB changes here. If I'm making 2.5 and 3 dB changes on this mastering EQ, that might be a little bit conceptually more than I know I maybe should be doing in mastering, but it doesn't look wrong to see the number 3. Sometimes when you create a crazy curve, it looks wrong even when it sounds right. And it's hard to get this EQ to look wrong, even if you're doing pretty extreme things with it. And a related reason this EQ can be useful to you is it strikes a beautiful balance between being really flexible. It's fully parametric. You can change the bandwidth. You can change the filter type. There's a whole bunch of frequencies to select from and some pretty meaningful boosts and cuts. But rather being confronted with the endless possibilities of like 100 EQ points, there's 4. And that kind of limitation in the digital age can be pretty refreshing. Honestly, when I see a lot of people using tons of breakpoints in a modern digital EQ, there will often be EQ points that are working at cross purposes or ones that are reinforcing each other and just have the effect really of widening the bandwidth or narrowing down the bandwidth. Generally, when it comes to mastering, I think the more minimal you can be with EQ, the better. And that doesn't only apply with the amount of EQ we're applying, but also the number of bands we're applying. Will I sometimes use more than 4 bands of EQ on a master? Yeah, it's not uncommon for me to stretch into 5 or 6, but it's also not uncommon on a good sounding mix for me to use 1 or 2 bands of EQ. And I really think that this kind of layout helps lead you in that more minimalist direction, which I think is ideal for mastering. And this gets me into our second reason why I think an EQ like this is interesting. It's because the frequency bands here aren't totally arbitrary. They are curated. And the guy who curated them, Leif Masses, he really spent a lot of time listening to each of these bands and figuring out how each one should sound. When you're developing an analog EQ, it's not like developing a digital EQ. He had to select specific frequency points and specific filter shapes, and using different components when you're creating an analog EQ leads to slightly different filter shapes and slightly different filter behavior. For instance, what's going on here in the Maselec EQ is just naturally a little bit different than what's going on in most digital EQs. In the first few dB of boost or cut, we're really getting a pretty wide, gradual, and gentle style of EQ. And as we go further and further, it gets tighter and tighter and more surgical, making some of these more extreme values still useful even in a mastering context. If this filter was the same width at 1 dB as it is at 4 or 5 dB, 4 and 5 dB probably wouldn't be very useful for mastering, but this thing is useful even at those more extreme settings in a mastering context of 4 and 5 dB. And that comes down to, in part, how those filter shapes have been curated. But these filter shapes are also a little bit unique to the analog world. You couldn't really recreate them very exactly, very easily, even with some of the most flexible digital graphical EQs out there. Specifically, some of these frequency bands are actually kind of asymmetrical. So rather than just giving you a fixed boost and cut of a specific amount, you might get a little bit more boost or cut on one side than the other. And that kind of asymmetry is actually fairly hard to do in a digital EQ unless you're using multiple EQ points instead of just a single band of EQ. And again, there are theoretical and practical reasons in mastering why you might want to use fewer bands of EQ rather than more bands of EQ to achieve the same result. And that leads to the third major reason that I think this kind of mastering EQ is still relevant today in the world of digital graphical EQs. And it is that some of those quirks and idiosyncrasies that we've been talking about, they factor into the color and character of this specific EQ, which has been heard on countless records that you and I have loved. Specifically, there's a lot of mastering engineers out there who really love the sound of the low and low mid bands on this EQ. They just sound different than the low and low mid bands on other EQs and any of the digital EQs I've played around with. I was led in different directions and got some instantly familiar results playing around with this EQ. And I think there's reasons it has been a classic in mastering studios for decades, heard on such a countless number of so many of your favorite records. Now, personally, I've become a big believer in digital tools in general. I've moved away from analog-only mastering, and I master almost exclusively with digital tools now, and often I will use more modern graphical EQs. But ever since I plugged this mastering EQ, and since this one, now a couple of other high-end mastering EQ hardware emulations into my workflow, I found myself using them so much more. My process has gotten faster. And while I think the results that I'm getting are honestly the same quality no matter what toolset I'm using, because I'm chasing an end sound and just doing whatever it takes to get there, the reality is that when I use tools like this, I work more quickly and have more fun. and get the same results with a smaller number of clicks and a smaller number of frequency bands. So that's what the Maselec EQ has been doing for me. I really love this thing, and it honestly has worked its way into my mastering template now, where I have one of these instantiated by default on literally every single master that I pull up, and I've been using it, I would say, on 80% of the masters that I'm doing today. The way that this compares to the original hardware is basically perfect. Speaking to Leif Masses about making this EQ, he told me that the difference between this EQ and the reference unit that they used is smaller than the difference between any two hardware units he's ever made. And we're talking about a boutique piece of high-end analog gear that costs something between $7,000 and $10,000 as of the time I'm recording this. But in addition to just getting the analog modeling right and really feeling and sounding so much like the original EQ, there's also a couple of features in here that are really cool. Two things that are super handy are, one, the ability to solo your EQ bands so you can hear exactly what you're changing. By hitting solo on one of these bands and then sweeping through the frequencies and changing the bandwidth, you get to hear exactly what part of the frequency spectrum you're having your effect on. But the most important thing to me is a feature that's only found in some of the most powerful modern digital graphical EQs, but it is found on this unit, and that is the ability to take this out of left-right mode and put it into mid-side mode for specific bands. So we have the ability to go here into the low mids and say just cut some low mids on the sides, but even boost them in the center. Or to add some high frequency to the sides or darken up the sides without touching the center. This is super handy to have, and I really don't know of any other analog modeled EQs of this style that have this feature. So this is super welcome. The ability to go into mid-side and the ability to solo each of these bands. Super useful to have. Now, if you've been interested enough to listen this far, you probably want to hear the thing. And I will play some audio examples for you, but the best way to hear it is to hear it on your own tracks. Go over to relabdevelopment.com where you can download the demo and do a free trial of this thing. This one is really made for mastering and for the mix bus, but you could absolutely use it on any number of instruments as well. That would have been cost prohibitive with the original units, but now it's incredibly easy. The other thing that I would suggest is come check out another video I'm doing with this EQ. It might even be up here already. I'll put it up here on the end screen if it is. And in this separate video, I'll give you a whole bunch of audio examples with this specific EQ. And we'll take a listen not only to how this specific EQ sounds, but I'll give you a feel for how to EQ any single track in the mastering context. Because really, there are only 4 ways to EQ any master. Any single master that I get in is going to fall into one of 4 basic categories. There are 4 general shapes that a mix can have in its overall frequency curve. Identifying what frequency shape your mix has, and therefore what frequency shape you should be doing on the EQ side in the master. Once you get that figured out, you are 80% of the way there to getting a great sounding master. Just understanding which 4 of these worlds are we in, which direction do we need to go, that is the first and most important battle to win in mastering. And once you've done that, you're already more than halfway there. So check out the new video on exactly that topic. And in the meantime, check out this EQ for yourself. Hear it on your own tracks over at relabdevelopment.com. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.